to my video explaining why I'm a feminist. What I'll lay out in this video is that A, inequality exists, B, it's a result of gender, C, it's created by sexist attitudes, and D, it can be fixed. So, let's get into it. First thing we need to establish is that gender inequality exists within our society. For the sake of this video, I'll be concentrating on Western industrialised nations. To begin with, almost everyone would agree that there are significant gender inequalities within other countries around the world, in particular countries like Saudi Arabia. Similarly, almost everyone would agree that Western societies also had significant gender inequality in the past. So the only question in this respect is whether such inequality has been eliminated in our modern societies. We'll start by looking for basic data on gender equality. There is plenty of straightforward data on this. Women in the USA earn 81 cents to every dollar that men earn. In Australia it's 82 cents in the dollar, and in Europe the exchange rate is 84 cents in the euro. What about political power? Well, there are only two countries in this world that do not have a majority male parliament: Rwanda and Andorra. That's it. In Europe, the average is 25% women. In the Nordic countries, those bastions of progressivism, the average is 42%. In the USA, it's 18%, and here in Australia, it's 26%. It's clear that a naive look at gender differences shows a strong connection between being a woman and having less power in society. And since gender is, for the sake of this video at least, essentially random and uncaused, the only possible causation is that being a woman causes one to have, on average, less power. So, do these differences in social power actually reflect discrimination against women? That is, are these factors caused by simply being a woman, or are there other non-discriminatory factors to consider? Well, let's look at earnings. There's actually a lot of research that shows that these differences are a reflection of discrimination. For example, there was a large study done by the US Government Accountability Office in 2003, and it was found that even after controlling for experience levels, education, industry, the particular job, marital status, number of children, and ethnicity, roughly half of the pay difference, or about 20%, remained as unexplained by any of those factors and most likely discrimination. In Australia, the National Centre for Social and Economic Modelling released a report in 2009 documenting that even after controlling a similar range of factors, roughly half the pay difference, or about 8%, remained as essentially unexplainable by non-discriminatory factors. Let's consider politicians. In most countries, the job of being a politician has no intrinsic qualities that should exclude women. The only possible factors that I could think of that may discourage women is the amount of travel required and the long hours. However, even in my state parliament, where the amounts of travel is much lower, the proportion of women MPs is only about 35%, 1 in 3. And as seen previously, worldwide percentages are consistently low. Note, although it's possible to find individual jurisdictions where there's equal representation, or particular jobs where women are paid at a higher rate, these remain steadfastly in the minority. When we look at US pay rates by industry, the results are clear. If we look at it break it down in terms of age, the results are clear. If there was no systemic discrimination, then we'd expect roughly equal number of cases where men were ahead and cases where women were ahead. And this is simply not what we find. Therefore, it is clear that there is some component of that is about discrimination. The next question we need to ask is, we need to consider what the mechanisms are by which being female leads to having less power in society. Now, as alluded to before, this may just be a natural result of innate differences between men and women, and not the result of discrimination and sexism. So, there's been a long history of research into differences between men and women. There are obvious anatomical differences, but in the context of a Western society, these are unlikely to have a reasonable role in limiting women's opportunity. There is a vanishingly small proportion of jobs in Western societies that actually rely on physical strength or athletic ability. The reason for this is because to do so would almost certainly expose those employees to excessive risk of injury. We have mechanised almost all of our physical labouring jobs. Therefore, outside of things like professional sport and frontline military service, which in themselves are a tiny proportion of the overall labour market, women's anatomy is no drawback. So if it's not anatomy, maybe it's psychology. Well, there's been a lot of research into psychological differences between men and women, and the results are actually fairly clear. Now, there's a number of reasons in which they have found small differences between men and women. But the thing is that the effect sizes vary greatly depending on the demographics of the participants in the study. Most notable one probably is that men consistently score higher, a few points higher on IQ tests than women. The interesting thing to note, though, is that this actually increases with age. So age 2, women generally score higher than men, and this changes as men and women get older and older. Also, the way that these things play out differs depending on culture. So if you look at men and women from different cultures, you get different effects coming through. What this suggests is that it is unlikely that these IQ differences are actually anything to do with innate abilities. We know that you can affect the IQ of a child through the way that you raise them and the environments you expose them to. And so it's not a great leap to suppose that the fact that men score better on IQ tests and that increases as they get older and older, as they're exposed more and more to different environments, probably doesn't have an innate basis. And actually, taken as a whole, there is actually little evidence to show that psychological differences are a result of nature. Let's consider the role that nurture plays in shaping men and women. We know that human development is incredibly malleable. The vast differences in behaviour, thinking, emotion and expression that we see between different contemporary cultures and between contemporary cultures and historical cultures are almost entirely due to nurture rather than nature. Humans of all cultures, including the vastly different cultures of the last several thousand years, have no significant genetic differences. It is not genes. Therefore, it's clear that the way that men and women think, feel and express themselves are determined almost entirely by their cultural context. For example, there are several known examples of matriarchal societies, including in Asia and North America. Now, the existence of such societies argues strongly against the idea that women are innately less interested in positions of power within society. As an adjunct to these ideas about culture, let's look at human nature. Science has conclusively shown the naive view of people as logical and rational agents is wrong. Psychology, economics, sociology, anthropology, even advertising have repeatedly demonstrated that human belief, action and thought have persistent blind spots that allow irrational imbalances to occur. The commonness of extreme forms of racism throughout history are a good example of how human thinking can be shaped by innate biases and perpetuated by culture. Now the question is, how much of the gender difference in our Western cultures can we attribute to innate differences between men and women, and how much is culturally determined? Now the best answer is that there is little or no reason to attribute any of the differences to innate differences. That's not to say that there aren't any innate differences, but simply that we have little reason to attribute any of it to them. Why? Well, because we know that cultural factors are so powerful, and we also know that our own attempts to be objective are likely to be severely flawed. In fact, as science has gotten better at controlling for cultural effects in experiments, when we experiment on these so-called innate differences, they actually disappear. And so what we see is that as the research quality gets better and better, the amount of innate differences that we find gets smaller and smaller. And therefore it's unlikely that any kind of significant difference actually exists. And we certainly don't have any evidence to conclude that thing. Now, the important thing here is not actually whether any of it is innate, but actually whether any of the current imbalance is attributable to nurture. And it's clear that at least some of it is. Therefore, Western societies are sexist, by definition. The only possible way to argue against the idea that Western societies are sexist is if you can assert that the known gaps in social standing are entirely based on innate differences, and that people have been able to circumvent all sexist attitudes, including their own unconscious biases. Now this is so staggeringly unlikely, particularly given the complete lack of evidence for it, as to leave us certain that our societies are still sexist. So, what do we do about it? Well, given that Western societies are still sexist, what are we going to do about it? There are two basic approaches to tackling sexism. Firstly, barriers to women achieving higher positions in society should be removed, and women should be encouraged to seek such positions. Secondly, the underlying beliefs and attitudes that support sexism should be challenged, and attitudes that support equality should be promoted. The full range of interventions for these are outside the scope of this already quite long video, so I'll concentrate on two of the most contentious. Firstly, let's look at quotas. The basic idea of quotas is, when selecting people for positions, to reserve a certain proportion of positions for women. Now, this seems counterintuitive for encouraging equality, but actually has a solid argument for it. The main objection that we hear is that we should select people based on merit. While this is superficially appealing, it fails for the simple reason that since sexism exists in hiring practices, we aren't actually selecting people on merit, even when we try to. If we think about a typical hiring process, there may be a process for gathering information on candidates through resumes and interviews, but coming to a decision based on this information usually amounts to nothing more than simply pick who you think is best, and that is prone to unconscious sexist biases. Having quotas can correct for this. If we know that women are valued at roughly 90% of the equivalent man, then a quota of 10% of positions for women will correct for this and produce a fairer outcome. Now, I'm not defending every implementation of quotas, as the devil very much is in the details, but the general principle of quotas is quite rational. The other area I'd like to look at is female representation within the media. Now, feminists often argue that we should take deliberate measures to represent women more equally in the media. The main objections to this is that the media just reflects reality, and that the media just reflects consumer expectations. Now, these objections fail because they're actually non sequiturs. The goal of better representation of women is to challenge sexist attitudes. The fact that consumers aren't necessarily asking for this is only a reasonable objection in a strictly commercial sense. And even then, there is evidence that actually better female representation does not hurt sales. The fact that reality is sexist in no way removes the onus on the media to represent society as closer to how we want it to be rather than strictly how it is. Whenever you represent women in media, that representation will either reinforce current sexist attitudes and stereotypes, or it will challenge them. Every single time you represent women, you're either going to challenge those attitudes or you're going to reinforce them. That's the only choice you have. And so the choice of going to the easy option is simply a choice to reinforce sexist stereotypes. Now, a few caveats. There are a few objections to feminism that I'd like to cover briefly. The first is the name feminism. Some people don't like this name because they think it implies a movement that is working for female superiority, or they would prefer the name humanism or just equality. Now, almost every feminist I have ever come across uses the word feminism to refer to working for equal rights and fair treatment. The reason that the movement is called feminism is simply because in our societies, women are the gender that is discriminated against, and it's their rights that are undermined. Secondly, I can understand a preference for a more gender-neutral name, but frankly, an issue of labelling is just not as important as the issues that feminism is fighting for. Now, the second objection is the idea that feminism is just man-hating, and while there are sometimes quite vocal feminists who hate men, there are many others that don't. And this is similar to the label atheist. There may be portions of the feminist movement that I disagree with, but generally what we disagree over is not actually the core principles of feminism. To summarise, women in Western societies are still disadvantaged in comparison to men. While great improvements have been made over the last 200 years or so, there is still a significant gap. The best way to address this imbalance is to encourage women into positions of power and to change people's sexist attitudes and beliefs. And that is why I'm a feminist.